The Meyer Broadcasting Company Editorial Board. I'm Mert Johnsrud, Director of Television Programming for the Meyer Television Network. My co-host today is Claire Ann Holmberg, who is Station Manager of Television for the Meyer Broadcasting Company.
Today we're going to have a rather special program. It's different, it's unique, and we're going to be going down memory lane today. I guess that's the best way of putting it. You've seen this gentleman on the program every week as the host, and today you're seeing him as the guest. We're talking about Bob MacLeod, who's Director of Standards and Public Affairs for the Meyer Broadcasting Company. How does it feel to be in that seat again, Bob?
It's not as comfortable as it is on the other side.
I'm sure it is.
You're in control, and
That's
I'm
right,
the victim.
Bob. Remember that all the way through the program. We're having this special program today because Bob is going to be, I guess we could use the term retiring. We're not going to talk a total retirement because he's going to continue to be participating in many things within the company. But he's not going to be sitting in his office each day from 8 to 5 o'clock. So we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the memories that Bob has of our company and to maybe show you some scenes of different things that Bob has been involved in. And Bob, let's get into, first of all, this particular program, the Editorial Board. Why was it? Why did we initially start? When did we start?
Well, the name is a misnomer now because we do not editorialize in the strict sense of editorializing. Meyer Broadcasting, both in radio and television, did editorialize back in the 50s and the early 60s. And we began having an editorial board by gathering a group of our management people and inviting a community leader, an expert in a field, a newsmaker, in simply to discuss possible editorial subjects. The board was held in one of our offices and was simply among ourselves for some time. Somewhere along the line, it became evident that the discussions were so interesting that it was a shame not to share them with our listeners and viewers. So one time we brought them into the studio, the whole board, and began trying to televise it and broadcast it for radio.
Now we have a still shot of that early editorial board. If we could look at that right now, we could actually show what Bob is describing. And there's a group of the people that were involved weekly. Do you want to continue then, Bob?
I'm not sure I can identify all of these people. You were there, and I am, and Tom Barr, manager of KFYR Radio. I can't identify the guests at the moment. This obviously was a group that was somewhat smaller than usual because normally we had about 8 of our people.
I think that young man sitting over there to the left is Mert Johnsrud.
I was expecting him to be the guest, I guess, and I sort of ignored.
I think that's Elsa Simonson, if I'm not mistaken.
I think that's what it is.
Elsa was the. I can't recall which office she was head of. State Laboratories at that time, and. We found that it was a little unwieldy as a television and radio program to do it that way, so we gradually reduced it till now we just have 2 people and a guest. And we no longer editorialize in the strict sense of an editorial being a statement of company opinion. We do have comment on some of our stations, but it's personal comment by our news people.
I know that, I'm sure you've heard that people say over the years that they can remember hearing your voice on radio and seeing you on television from years and years ago, and you maybe get a little tired of hearing that. But even with all the, as you being really a member of the family, so to speak, with many people throughout all the years from the 40s on, I wonder if you'd be willing to share with us a little more about your background, about your home, where you were born, and how you became to be a permanent fixture here in North Dakota.
And also the number of years that you've been
Well, it just sort of happened. I was born and raised in Denver. And somewhere along the line got the idea I wanted to be a radio announcer back in the old heyday of radio when what they now call disc jockeys were announcers. And they were the dignified oratorical types, the old Norman Brokenshire and Harry Von Zell and Graham McNamee, the original coast-to-coast NBC announcer. And I finally got a job at KVOD in Denver, which is now KHOW, on a part-time basis when I was in high school in 1935. So I have spent almost 48 years before the microphone and the last 25 or 30 years before the camera, too. And this was in the Great Depression. Wages were low and jobs were somewhat unstable. And that job was not really very permanent, nor was it full-time. So I set about on a campaign of trying to find a job somewhere else, and I really wanted to work in a smaller community than the big city. And so I wrote to many stations in this part of the country, the central part of the country, and this was the first one that hired me on a 1-month trial basis. So far as I know, I never passed the trial. I was never notified that I had passed muster.
And that was 1930?
That was 1939, the early part of 1939.
And that was in radio then as an announcer here
Yes.
at KFYR. And then let's progress a bit beyond that point, Bob. Then talk a little bit about your career and going from in radio, what you did there, and then moving into the different positions that you have held.
Well, in 1942, I was appointed program director for KFYR Radio. Then in early 1944, the Burleigh County Draft Board awarded me an all-expense tour of the South Pacific for a couple of years. And after the war was over in mid-1946, I came back.
But during the war, you did do some radio work also, right?
Yes, I was editor of the first radio editor of the First Information and Historical Service, which was just being formed in Honolulu when I arrived there as an infantry rifleman replacement. Mm-hmm. And we were assigned the task of trying to convince the folks back home that the Army was also helping to win the war in the Pacific, as well as the Air Corps, now the Air Force, and the Navy, who were getting most of the headlines. And we also were assigned the task, the historical section of our unit, of writing the history of the Army's participation in the Pacific War. And the newspaper and radio sections were assigned the task of assisting the network and newspaper and news association correspondents in getting their stories. But basically, our radio people made recordings on wire recorders of the action in the Pacific and tried to get interviews to send to the hometown stations. So we covered the war in that respect.
Then after the war, you came back to Bismarck and
was appointed sales manager at KFYR.
Okay, we have a couple still shots, and I don't know, if you're pleased with this or not, but I'm pleased with it. So we'd like to show this, show the photos at this time. Maybe Bob can talk a little bit about that.
I think that's
also.
Former Governor John Davis, and I'm guessing that this is at the time when KFYR Radio was observing its 25th anniversary, which would have been in 1950. Because that is one of the old original carbon microphones. The microphone itself is mounted in a ring on springs because they were very sensitive to vibration and to motion. And then it's covered with that screened housing with the holes screened lightly. And we had that microphone dug out of the archives somewhere around here and silver plated for that silver anniversary. And I believe Governor Davis was governor at that time and came down and made some remarks.
Obviously, the microphone being used probably for the broadcast was the one that appears in the top of the screen.
The one hanging down from an overhead boom.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now we have another shot of Bob here, that a suave photo of Mr. MacLeod. I think we have that one also, don't we? Okay. There we are.
That was probably a typical picture taken of the
that was
probably maybe the what is it, dial lights or the
Dial Lights magazine?
Right.
It was used for publicity purposes, but I can't recall the exact time. Obviously, a few years ago.
What is the going back to radio now? What is the what do you think of when you hear? And I've heard this from so many people that I've talked to. When I say, "What do you remember about Bob? What are some of the things on radio?" Of the time has come, the walrus said to speak.
Well, I did a series, and I think that publicity picture you just showed was taken for that. Back in the very late 40s and early 50s, and up to about the time television came in, I did a comment, I guess, daily, called Of Cabbages and Kings. I took the old four-line couplet from The Carpenter and the Walrus of Lewis Carroll. The time has come, the walrus said, to talk of many things. The talk of many things, covering the idea that I had talked of anything that popped into my head.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a 5-minute program, which...
Now, how long did you have that program, Bob? Because I know so many people recall that particular one.
I believe that started in about 1949 and ran until about 1954.
Well, radio has changed, of course, very much over the years. But one of the major things that I think many people may have forgotten was that recorded music, as we know it today, popular recorded music, had to be modified a lot during the early years of radio because of copyright restrictions. And you might want to talk a little bit about that.
Well, in the very early years of radio, before my time, stations did use phonograph records. As a matter of fact, I really believe that KFYR was begun originally as an incentive for the sale of phonograph records at the Hoskins Meyer store, which was partly owned by Mr. P.J. Meyer, who founded KFYR. And they sold records and Victrolas, and I really believe that in the back of his head, at least, the idea of a radio station would promote the sale of radios, which they also sold, and records. So I think records were used in the early days, but by the time I began in the early 30s, or the mid-30s, in radio, it was illegal to play phonograph records on radio because of the copyright restrictions. So what became known as the electrical transcription was developed, and electrical transcription services. There were 3 major ones: Standard Radio, Associated Program Services, and World Program Services. And they made the old big 16-inch records with 8 or 10 selections on each side. Some of them were of excellent quality, as good as the quality of the finest modern records, except for the new digital records. And we bought those services, and the bands that played on them generally were either staff bands of the organization that made the library services, or else they took the dance bands of the day and changed their names. One I remember was Russ Morgan played as Rex Milburn. Usually the first initials were the same. But we had to call him Rex Milburn, and we had to say on the air that this was an electrical transcription before each selection or after it. And we became rather ingenious in hiding that transcription word somewhere in the copy so that it wasn't too noticeable, because we didn't like the idea. We tried to make everything sound like it was live.
And also, but there was more live music also with studio musicians and so on.
Yes, the networks, if you were a network affiliate, you had a lot of live music. We had the Old Breakfast Club in the morning out of Chicago, Club Matinee in the afternoons, the Farm and Home Hour in the mid-morning, and in the evening, the top comedy programs and musical programs, Bob Hope, Jack Benny, Fibber McGee and Molly, Fred Allen, that type of thing in the evening, just as television does now.
Well, we also had, isn't that true, in radio at that time, the live music from, say, this particular studio.
But I was talking about the network programs, and then late at night, the various networks would tie up various ballrooms in the country. NBC had the Meadowbrook in New Jersey every night, or maybe 3 times a week, or maybe twice a week. And whatever band, one of the big bands, was playing at the Meadowbrook was on in that spot. And they might have the Aragon Ballroom in Chicago, and later the Trianon on the West Coast. And the old live dance bands filled those hours after 10:30 at night until midnight. And all of the networks did that. But we also had, during the 40s and early 50s, we had live music here at KFYR in the morning on the old What's the Weather program, and at noon on the Northwest Farm Front. Then we had Mike Dosh playing his organ, and we had various live musical programs here.
In fact, one of our employees with our station happens to be Emil Doctor, who played in that
Emil played the accordion
right.
in that band, both at noon and in the morning.
You had mentioned that Mr. Meyer had founded Meyer Broadcasting Company. Is there any special memory that you have, or some story you could tell about Mr. Meyer?
A lot of stories. Lovely man. Very, very charming, very handsome, obviously a visionary, because he affiliated with NBC back in the very beginning of the 30s. About 1931, the negotiations were completed, and that's before my time, of course. But that had to be a very calculated risk at that time, because the cost of bringing those programs in from Minneapolis to Fargo and then to Bismarck was enormous. And the station in Fargo, WDAY, joined at the same time. But that also made KFYR the important station it was at that time, one of the most important stations in this part of the country. And it was considered for many years as one of the great stations. But I did not meet Mr. Meyer when I first came here for a few months, because he generally spent his winters, he and his wife, in Florida, and their summers at Detroit Lakes. And the studios we had at that time were painted white with dark redwood trim. And the studios were lined with the old Celotex perforated panels for sound purposes, and they were just a dull white. And a couple of us persuaded Frank Fitzsimmons, who was then manager, that the studios would be a much pleasanter place to work in if we could make them a little lighter and a little more modern looking, and could we please paint them light blue or some pleasant color, and paint the woodwork ivory. So we painted the one studio in the hall, which showed into the hallway, a light peach, I thought. And about the time we finished, Mr. Meyer came to Bismarck. And I just walked out of the control room one day, and I had not met him, but I knew who he was, and I'd seen his picture, so I knew who it was coming down the hall. And he looked in the studio and went right through the ceiling and said, "Who in the hell is painting my studio pink?" But I think he was more kidding than he was really angry. Mm-hmm. Anyway, he accepted it. But there were a couple of other instances. One time when NBC lost the great prize fight pickups, which they had exclusively for many years, and they went to Mutual Radio. And about the time it happened, one of the great fights of all time involving Joe Louis was held in Detroit. And there were just two of us on duty that night. And the telephones, we had two lines, were driving us crazy. We couldn't do our work. John Henline was on the controls. We had technical operators handling the controls at that time. And between the two of us, we were answering the phone just as fast as we could hang up, it'd ring again. And somewhere along the line, I got a little tired of answering the phone and thought I'd be a little kittenish, and I picked up the phone when it rang and said, "Patty's Pig Poke."
I know what you're going to say.
And the beautiful voice on the other end said, "Bob, this is Mr. Meyer. Would you do so-and-so for me?" He never mentioned it to me, but it's the last time I ever made a smart remark on the phone and without knowing who I was talking to.
I believe also that Mr. Meyer was very instrumental in the formation or in the development of one of the major rep firms for television and radio related
yes,
television sales.
Obviously, radio stations cannot sell national advertising, and television stations easily if they have to hire a salesman to be in all of the major markets for national advertising, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and so forth. And in the late 30s, Mr. Meyer and John Blair of Chicago negotiated an agreement whereby Mr. Blair, who was then starting that type of firm, took on KFYR as one of his clients. And that merging of talents resulted in a great advance for KFYR as far as selling was concerned in those areas, because he was one of the pioneers, Mr. Blair was. And it also was the first big account Mr. Blair had. So they have always considered KFYR one of their great clients.
We have, I don't know just how much time we have left. What do we have, Dan? Because we want to show about a 4-minute clip. Okay, we have a 4-minute tape here that we would like to show too, with Bob again, describing some equipment that is used in the studio in 1953, is that correct?
TV in 53.
TV in 53, and then a follow-up in 1978 to see the comparison and the changes that have taken place in technology. Let's show the tape now.
Good evening. We at KFYR pretty well mastered the techniques of bringing you sounds, music, speeches, but we haven't mastered the techniques yet of bringing you pictures with those sounds. We're learning a whole new industry here at KFYR TV in order to bring you the pictures. We have, for instance, the live image orthicon television camera to master. This is the camera here. You see it has a battery of lenses to give you different viewpoints in its front. Its insides are a maze of tubes and other electronic equipment. This is just one small section of the many tubes inside a TV camera. In all, there are some 150 tubes within this particular camera. When the operator wishes to see what is being filmed, well, it isn't exactly filmed, but when he wishes to see what he's taking, he looks through the viewfinder. In this case, the viewfinder, instead of being an optical instrument, is an electronic instrument, very much like your TV set in your own home. This is a picture tube, and the tube which picks up the picture through the lenses on the front of the camera is also the same type of tube. Now, all of our pictures here at KFYR will not be produced with a live TV camera. In many cases, it will be impossible to give you programs live. So we have many other types of cameras here. This is the standard newsreel man's camera for bringing you newsreels of events such as fires, train wrecks, things of that sort. As they occur, we will use the newsreel camera. It carries no sound. We also have sound on film cameras for filming speeches and things of that sort where sound is necessary. In addition, we have still cameras. All television pictures do not move. In some cases, it's neither practical nor possible to take motion pictures, so we have the standard newsman speed graphic camera here at the KFYR photo department. We also use the small, compact type of camera used by magazine photographers for use in places where portability is important. And we have the very small cameras for making slides, doing copies of commercial advertisements and so forth. We have many new things here at KFYR TV in order to ensure you the most interesting picture at all times. We hope you'll enjoy the programs we produce here in the KFYR photo department, as well as the programs we receive from the various networks.
25 years can bring a lot of changes in equipment and I guess in people. This is some of the camera equipment which KFYR TV uses in 1978. On the surface, some of it looks quite similar to what it did in 1953, but inside it's considerably different. This is the studio camera. Two of them are used in our studios now. They have enormous zoom lenses compared with the lenses used back in 1953. There are no tubes in them except for the picture tubes, and really this camera contains almost 4 times the amount of equipment contained in that first camera used back in 1953, one for each of the primary colors, plus one for black and white. These units you see on the table before me are the small so-called mini-cams used for covering news events and for almost any kind of field operations. This camera is a color camera. It does a beautiful job. This is the battery belt, which powers it. This is a tape recorder, a cassette recorder, which makes excellent videotape recordings in the field for commercials, for covering news events, for any type of work outside the studio. So you can see 25 years has made a lot of difference in equipment and in people.
There's been a lot of dramatic changes even since 1978 in equipment.
It's a very rapidly changing industry.
It would be interesting to do another one at this time.
Well, Bob's life has been involved with sound and pictures, but not just television pictures, because all of us who know him very well know that he is an excellent photographer, and we have a sample here of some of your work, and I think this, of course, is a Hawaiian picture.
That's Waimea Canyon on the island of Kauai in Hawaii.
But I think
one of the most spectacular canyons in the Pacific.
Very impressive to those of us and all of us who are proud of North Dakota would be your work in documenting and your pride in North Dakota, which you've shown in your pictures. I think those are excellent, and for all of you who have a chance, whenever they're displayed, take a look, because you'll see North Dakota as you've never seen it before.
Thank you.
We've talked about this too, and we've invited people to come up to the station. We have many of Bob's. This is just one sampling of it, but we have many of Bob's prints here in our right within our company, and we certainly invite you to come in to any one of our stations and see his beautiful prints. We want to talk just a little bit about the future of Bob. I don't know if we really made that extremely clear about what you are going to be doing as far as our company is concerned, Bob, and also what kinds of things you're going to be doing that are exciting and to you, things that are going to be fun for you to do.
Well, it's going to be fun. I'm retiring in a technical sense early next month, and at least retiring from the routine and the structured life which ties you down to a certain extent in broadcasting. I've been, in a sense, a slave to a clock for 48 years, so I'm going to get away from that.
I know you
And,
said one thing you're going to enjoy is not having to get up at a certain time in the morning.
Or not having to get to work at a certain
Okay.
time. But I am going to continue to do some consulting work for the company, so I will continue my association. I've been involved in the semi-legal aspects of broadcasting for many years, and I'm going to continue to work with our management people on that level for at least some time into the future. As far as personal efforts, I'll continue with my photography, I suppose, and my wife and I will travel some. But it will be fun to be able to pick up and go when the spirit moves us rather than when the schedule says we're free.
Well, that's talking about being slave to the clock. That is what's happening right now. Our time is up. But we'd like to thank you, Bob, for being our guest today. It's been most interesting, and thank you for the wonderful years, the many years as a co-worker and friend. It's been great. Thanks for being here.
And thank you all.
So our guest today has been Bob MacLeod, Director of Standards and Public Affairs for Meyer Broadcasting Company. I'm Mert Johnsrud, Director of Television Programming, and co-host today has been Claire Ann Holmberg, who is Station Manager of Television.
And I want to shake Bob's hand. Thank you, Bob.
Thanks, Bob. Join us again next week.